Our objectives this afternoon are to discuss ways to analyze how interaction items impact rigor and complexity, as well as analyze the implications for instruction and local assessment, and then reflect on next steps for instruction and assessment practices. So those are going to be some key items that we've been engaging in or have begun engaging in preparation for new items on our state assessments. So our agenda that we will follow this afternoon is looking back to look forward, assessment consideration. We'll have some questions on synthesizing and strategizing the information that we've gone over. We'll look at best practices for item bank use and also how to navigate the item bank in Aware. The bulk of our time will be spent on those first 3 items listed here on the agenda. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Karen to present on our Beyond the 25% quota.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Tara. I am super excited to be here. I just want to start by saying thank you to the Appropriateyl team for inviting TEKSbank to join in on the Wednesday webinar fun. I am a longtime listener, but a first-time caller, so I'm super thrilled to be here. My team, TEKSbank, is the team behind the creation and editing of what we like to consider the ultimate assist in Appropriateyl assessment authoring platform inside of Aware. My name is Karen Zambrana, and I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation today. I'd like to start by giving a little context to why my team started working on the concept for this presentation. You know, we've had the pleasure of chatting with educators all over Texas about the move to non-multiple choice items. And we've realized along the way that there's a need for a strategic plan to transition to these new item types or TIs or interactive items, whatever you like to call them, because we can't just have one name for anything in education. So we're here to help structure the conversation around the implications for assessment. We'll analyze the limitations of past assessment items and dive into 6 key factors for strategic implementation. And to avoid leaving you with just some food for thought, we'll give you 3 questions to consider when you want to spark productive conversations with your colleagues, or of course with yourself. I see you out there, Island of One educators, I've been there. So let's get started. They say those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. So let's take a look back to where we've been in the world of assessment so that we can get a clearer view looking forward. This way we can define the why for this change and then set the stage for best assessment design practices. Alrighty, I'm gonna ask for a little audience participation here. Let's check out an example from 2019. First, we're going to focus on standard 4.9a, which is all about representing data. Next, after looking at that standard, I want you to compare that to what the question is asking students to do. So the question prompt is right there on the slide. So take a sec to check it out, and then don't be shy. Share your thoughts in the chat. So what do you notice when you compare the language in the standard to the assessment item you see here? And just in case it's small on your screen, I'll go ahead and give you a synopsis. So the standard is represent data on a frequency table, dot plot, or stem and leaf plot marked with whole numbers and fractions. Then the question says, which frequency table represents the number of students who chose each color? So I'm seeing some answers coming in. Yep, representing peak versus identifying a correct representation. Thank you so much, Wendy. Paloma says it's represented for the students. So it's built out there for the students. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts on that? All right, well, let's jump into the future now on our next slide. That's where we were, and this is where we are going. Many of you that responded hit right on this, and it's absolutely true. Until now, we've been confined to questions that can really only ask students to identify, when that is not what the standard asks of students. But here you can see that with the use of a drag and drop into a table, students can more accurately demonstrate their knowledge in a way that actually aligns to what the standard intended. All right, let's go back to not too far ago, 2021. So here we have an RLA item asking students to explain the author's purpose and message within a text. Here we have the dreaded rote question that yields little to no context into why our students chose the answer they did and what their thinking is. Every administrator visiting a classroom is looking for that questioning that not only asks what, but why, because explaining why is a deeper and more complex task. So this is where we were. And now here is where we're going. A two-part question that incites a deeper analysis of the text. And if I can also point out, the text is aligned to the questions being asked. No more asking our students to flip back and forth. And I would imagine that this is authentic to what your computer screen looks like right now, right? Content or information aligned side by side to the task at hand, more authentic to how we interact today. But most importantly, with the two-part question, this means we have the ability to assess the standard at a deeper and more complex level where we don't just ask what, but we ask what and then back your thinking up with evidence to tell me why. This is a less passive and more active demonstration of knowledge where we have the ability to assess at a deeper and more complex level, rendering a better understanding of what our students know and what they're ready to learn next, or what we need to plan on reteaching. All right, let's take a look at another one. So here we are all the way back in 2013 for 8.7b, where we want our students to be able to demonstrate and predict the sequence of events in the lunar cycle. This example always gets me cracked up because it takes me back to visions of me as an elementary math and science teacher trying to teach a very similar standard at the 4th grade level. And I know that the learning around the lunar cycle involves a lot of in-depth and complex teaching and learning. You know, hopefully students are journaling each evening to log the lunar cycle, or we have a classroom of half-eaten Oreos and you're yelling, "Don't eat them yet, we're not done." Or we're building 3D models and acting out the cycle with a flashlight and a styrofoam ball. You know, such dynamic and complex learning going on. And then this is how we assess knowledge. Give me one moon phase that comes next, while removing the context of the imagery so pertinent to the standard here. So, but now here's where we're going. An active demonstration of knowledge. And while I must always point out that we are not yet stepping into the metaverse for assessment, we are getting closer to actually matching the dynamic way in which the content was taught and learned. Okay, so now we've done a little time travel to set the stage for why. Let's get into the how. How do we reach the ultimate goal of what assessment is for? Measuring what students know to yield actionable data to drive learning progress. What I'm going to share with you all next are 6 key considerations to evaluate as you embed new item types into your assessment practice. We really want to move beyond the random deletion of multiple choice items and the arbitrary replacement with TEIs to a thoughtful, analytic practice of utilizing TEIs when they can give us the data we need and that we can use. So, first up, like I said before, my team has had the opportunity to have in-depth conversations with LEAs across Texas. And one thing we've heard over and over again from very well-meaning educators is that they're excited to tell us that they pack their assessments with TEIs in order to give students ample practice with new item types. But then what we hear over and over again when checking back in was that their students performed unexpectedly poorly due to the observed increased testing fatigue with the incredibly elevated cognitive rigor that most TEIs are going to provide. Which, you can think about it, we saw a great example of that with the moon phases question we looked at before. The depth and complexity in the TEI version of that question is substantially different than the previous multiple choice example. So it's really not a one-to-one correlation that you could make. These learning communities were also left with data visualization so incredibly complex, there wasn't the bandwidth to properly investigate the data and then do the important part of actually acting on it. And to be fair, this completely makes sense. Not every data need can be answered from a TEI. The same way a multiple choice item doesn't always provide the information we need about what our students know. So with this in mind, we have to start with a plan, or an assessment blueprint, as we like to call it. On the screen, you'll see an example of the STAR blueprint. We see the outline and frequency expected for each reporting category, and then we see the expected outline for the item type. So consideration 1 is make a plan for the framework of your assessment and commit to referencing it as you build out your assessments through the year. All right. The next consideration to think about is one where I am going to again ask for a little audience participation. So get your fingers warmed up, get your brains going. I want you to take a look at this list of all the different new item types. We've spent plenty of time, all of us have spent plenty of time learning about what these item types are and how they function. We've got it. We know what they do. But what I want you to take a look at now is how I've got them grouped. Look at the left column as it compares to the items grouped in the right column. So take a minute and share your thoughts in the chat. I've got the question up there. What is different about the item type in the left column versus the right? Think about what the students have to do. And feel free, once you kind of have some ideas, to share what you're thinking in the chat. We've got one. Selecting answers versus generating answers. Yep, absolutely. In the left column, students have choice. Yes, and that's a word I'm about to use a lot on the next slide. So you hit it on the head there. Column on the left is selecting, and the column on the right is constructing their thought. Absolutely. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide there. Yep. Many of you hit it on the nail, or I can't ever say that correctly. Many of you hit the nail on the head here. A lot of these new item types are versions of a multiple choice or selective response item, in that students read a question and are presented with a set of responses from which they choose to best answer, just not an ABCD format. Our team likes to refer to these as the artist formerly known as multiple choice. We are not known to be the coolest kids at Region 10, but we try. Similar, but not the same, not exactly the same. But that cognitive load is lessened because students are obviously scaffolded when they are given structured answer choices to choose from. In contrast, the grouping on the right is comprised of truly open-ended items that require completely student-generated answers by doing things like writing for text entry or creating a number line. These items are going to require a different type of thinking than kids are used to in state assessments because they do not have that choice part to fall back on. I shared with you that I'm a former math and science teacher, and I remember poring over STAR and local summative assessments and data PLCs. And without fail, those griddable questions, those grittables, would be some of the lowest performing every single time. And as much as we may have wanted to blame it on this, it wasn't because students couldn't bubble in their answers. It was because they were asked to generate their answer without the scaffolding that answer choices can provide. So when you prioritize the kinds of item types you want to include purely for the goal of exposing students to new expectations of how they demonstrate their knowledge, You and your team may say, I'm not as worried about hotspot or inline choice because those are still really selective response. And let's be honest, the majority of our students aren't going to have problems with the tech skill side of things. Quick example for that. I was FaceTiming with my 1-year-old niece, little Charlotte, the other day, and she swiped a notification up to clear it from her view. She is one and has a mother who thinks that she does not allow screen time. Fluent interactivity with tech is really a second language, is not a second language. It's not a second language for her or many of our students, as it is for many of us from other or older generations. But I do want to pause and I want to make sure that I acknowledge that I'm referencing tech fluency for most, and that there are certainly examples where that is not the case for all, but for most. But what all my students may not have as much experience with is, while they can do the tech skill of it, but have my kids ever on a high stakes assessment designed a graph from scratch, or created their own Fraxton model, or written a constructed response? So those may be the ones that you really want to prioritize exposing your students to in your organization. So the evaluation of the complexity implications from the different item types may spark a focus on what item types to prioritize for just exposure. But it can also spark the conversation around whether our instruction is up to par in order to prepare students for this type of questioning. Where is our backwards design practice right now? Are we truly starting at the standard, or are we starting with a previous STAR question, which segues us to our next consideration, which focuses on the fact that with the expansion of available assessment item types, we really now have the opportunity to reevaluate old assessments and look for questions that didn't really match up to the expectation lined out in the standard, and then redesign them to more accurately measure learning. For example, we have a lot of standards that say things like explain or demonstrate or classify. These are all very active verbs. And we hope that when a teacher plans a unit for the standard, for this kind of standard we see on the screen, they've got lots of activities where students are actually, let's say, building a circuit to see what happens, and problem solving when the light bulb won't light up or the buzzer won't sound. As a teacher, I was sometimes happy when the buzzer wouldn't sound because, well, if you've been there, you've been there, We expect that students are actually engineering and talking and explaining and disagreeing and working together to understand and explain the flow of electricity in this very authentic way. And then on Friday, we say, but this is how you will see it on STAR. So stop demonstrating and now identify what is correct. Of course, identify what is correct after you sift through the 3 other non-answers. Now we have more opportunities to match really good instructional practices around a concept or a standard to how we assess that standard. And this opportunity, it may just be the most sense we've made in education for a long time. All right, and let's take a look at the next slide here, because the TEKSbank team believes sharing is caring, as my 4-year-old says when he wants his sister's dessert. We want to share this next document with you. It is simple, very simple, but proven very, very helpful for our team. It's linked out from the presentation, and I've also included a bit.ly on the slide. You can jot down if you'd like to be able to access it. But we made this because we wanted our TEKSbank writers to rethink how they develop questions when analyzing a standard. So this document aligns new item types to verbs you see in our TEKS. It kind of really makes it simple. So for example, on the top line, you're going to see that you might consider a drag and drop question when students are asked to categorize, contrast, sequence, etc. We are hoping that this can be a handy resource for your instructional leaders to use when rethinking assessment. And as we move through the rest of our presentation, we're going to see some examples that all come from our TEKSbank team that I was just referencing. Because in addition to the 65,000 multiple choice items we offer at TEKSbank, over the past year, we've actually added 12,000 TEIs from our assessment authors who, by the way, are all Texas educators. And TEKSbank is on course to add 8,000 more TEIs by December 2023. So we're super excited about that. My team's passion for assessment design focuses on one thing: student progress. Our items start at the foundation of concept attainment and increase in complexity to align to the student's learning trajectory. TEKSbank does this to allow assessment authors to appropriately scaffold new item types and to vary item types as content complexity increases, which we're going to talk about next. I think Emily was giving you a little demo of what you can see when you click on that link. Thank you. All right, so this brings us to our fourth consideration. The same way we scaffold the level of content complexity we employ in our assessment items, we also need to add in the layer of scaffolding the interaction complexity we use. Because as we've already discussed, increased interactivity inherently increases the cognitive demand in a question. It's going to make it harder. So before you give students this, which is what you see on the screen, this is a really complex inline choice item, which is made more rigorous by the 5 interactions a student must successfully answer. Why not give them this? Let's make sure they can do this. Where in this version, students are given more information and less inline choice interactions. And we can provide more scaffolding, which will simplify the cognitive rigor and give us a clearer analysis on whether students know how to interact with this type of question, inline choice. While the text side of it will come naturally for most, like we've just discussed prior, what we do need to build is their capabilities of using those text skills in the assessment arena. That's where it's a little bit different, where they now need to use those skills to show what they know on a high stakes assessment, not just, Facebook or a video game. I said Facebook, that really aged me, but you know what I mean. All right, let's take a look at another example. So as another example, again, before you ask students to generate an open-ended response using something like an equation editor you see here, which is what might be expected to demonstrate mastery on a summative assessment, before you do that, scaffold their process by employing a selected response item type. So kind of take that open response item type and see how you can align it to something that's more of a selected response, like drag and drop. Here, students still need to be at a certain point in their learning trajectory to correctly answer the question, but not per se at the level of mastery yet where they can easily parlay their knowledge in a more rigorous item type, like an open-ended response using an equation editor. Okay, so now we're going to make a very nuanced move to our fifth consideration, where we're going to move from scaffolding as far as exposure to a new item type to now a focus on scaffolding the content complexity of the interactive items, really to meet the learner where they are in their attainment of knowledge. a passion we have on our TEKSbank team is spreading awareness about the importance of appropriately and moreover ethically assessing students in alignment to where they are in their learning. Let's think about the summative end of year type of assessments that STAR is meant for. Assessing to measure whether students have developed mastery over an entire year of exposure to these standards. The expectation here being that students would have been taught, retaught, and probably had the content spiraled back in if needed through the curriculum by the end of the year, right? They would have had time to develop mastery. But we have to ask ourselves, does that same logic apply to the Friday quiz? Or the week 1, unit 1 formative assessment that a teacher builds when they've only exposed students to this content for a few days? No, it really doesn't align. The students are at a different point in their learning trajectory, which means, they may not be ready to demonstrate learning in a complex and open-ended way. They're getting there. They're just not quite ready for that. Meaning, you can't just necessarily go grab a STAR new item type from the sample set and throw it on your first formative assessment. If it's a standard that needs to be spiraled back in before students have time to really develop mastery. If this is the practice, you'll have a lot of frustrated students, and you're going to have data that you can't do a lot with because the assessment was not properly designed. So here we start with a simple multiple choice question that may be appropriate for my students right at the beginning of their understanding of how to classify matter in a 5th grade classroom. Now, as they grow in their understanding, we may move to our next slide where this complexity grows as now I ask students to recall what they've learned about different forms of matter. So there's a bit of recall happening here, but then generate conclusions about the density of each item. Also, the level of rigor here is amped up simply by asking students to identify 2 correct answers rather than 1. So a student's going to have a more complex understanding of the content to be able to perform and demonstrate what they know on this type of question. So then, as their learning progresses, we might move to our expectation of demonstrating knowledge where it becomes even more sophisticated by removing the imagery from the answer choices. And then again, asking for an extended analysis of the answer choices, given that this is a multi-select question where there are 2 correct answers. Then, after this type of question, we move more into the arena of mastery. So we're coming to the end of the learning cycle here, and we ask our students to analyze data and then to generate a completely open-ended constructive response. Here, we're questioning in a way that aligns with the expectation of a student to be closer to the mastery level of their learning trajectory. This last example really put the student's comprehension to the test. And it's going to give a summative and comprehensive look at what they know and at what level of complexity they truly understand the content. But given that this type of questioning yields a more summative analysis of what a student knows, we have to be ready to ask ourselves, is that the data we always need when we are still able to intervene? Which takes me to our final point, and arguably the most important consideration. Data needs must drive item choice. So you wouldn't expect a member of a team who has spent countless hours researching and developing tech-enhanced items to say what I'm going to say next. Sometimes a nice, clean, multiple choice item is the best fit for your assessment. And sometimes it's not. At the end of the day, it truly boils down to what you need to know about what your students know. And what item type is going to deliver the data you need to grow your student or even your curriculum program. All right, so those were our 6 points. And now I want to take some time to bring it all together. You know, anytime I facilitate a training or a meeting of the minds like today, I always want to make sure that you are able to walk away from our time together with some truly defined and actionable ways to be strategic in how you initiate progress and how you plan to implement everything we've discussed today, which admittedly is quite a lot. We've gone over quite a lot. So coming up, I have synthesized the information down into 3 ways to get the conversation started. So first, start by prioritizing your standards. Number 1, first meeting, let's prioritize our standards. Which standards were never really assessed correctly? And I'm sure many of you know the ones. They are the ones that take over any and every chance of progress in a data meeting, because all we can talk about is the fact that it was a, quote, bad question, right? Which TEK says compare and contrast, but was assessed in the past via multiple choice? This is a question you can ask yourself. Where is it appropriate to dive deeper into a student's demonstration of knowledge using, for instance, match table grid or drag and drop? You know, aside from taking over data meetings, these standards can oftentimes present themselves as your lowest performing standards, a lot like those gridables, simply because the assessment couldn't match the instruction. So an audit of those standards for the purpose of changing how they are assessed can be a really helpful way to get started. So first, prioritize your standards. Then, next up, analyze the verb and where you are in your learning progression. And when I say analyze the verbs, I want you to know I'm not just talking about circling a verb here on a piece of paper. Really dive in and analyze. What pieces are we missing so that you can identify where the gaps in learning are occurring? You know, does the verb in the standard really align to the thinking required in a new item type? Also, where are my students in their learning trajectory? Will that level of rigor in a new item type align to where the students are in their learning? So what are they actually ready to be assessed on? And what will render the most actionable data moving forward, which takes us to number 3. With the expansion of our assessment capabilities, we cannot get excited and lose sight of the end goal. Remember, a lot goes on in a classroom or a school in a day. So number 3 is that we need to be realistic about our data needs and our intervention bandwidth. Well, the item types you use give you the data you need to efficiently intervene. I mean, at the end of the day, I can confidently say I've never met a teacher who proudly proclaimed that they got into teaching for the tests, right? That's not what we got into it for. But assessment is an integral part of knowing where our students are in their learning trajectory. And it gives educators the insight we need to prepare them for what's next. So design your assessments to do just that. Assess to progress. And while I'm in no form or fashion a quote kind of person, this next one was just too perfect not to include. In the end, you should only measure and look at the numbers that drive action, meaning that the data tells you what you should do next. And at the end of the day, that should always be our goal in assessment. So I want to thank you all so very much for hearing me out today. This presentation and the information shared has been built and rebuilt by many of my team members. And we really, truly hope it helps clear the path for a thoughtful plan moving forward into the future, or perhaps the right now in your assessment design. If you'd like to learn more about TEKSbank, or even just want to chat about assessment design, reach out to us by visiting our website and filling out an interest form, or just shooting us an email. Emily, I'm going to send it back over to you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Karen. I'll pause and see if any questions that you may have for Karen before we transition over. And if not, I'm just going to cover some basic navigation and aware, but I'll kind of wait, see if there's anything that anybody wants to ask. I'll give you a second. Karen did an awesome job giving us some things to think about and some processes to evaluate, rather than just having a gut punch response to changing our assessment. So I like all of those ideas. Very well thought out. All right, I didn't see anything come in. So for the remainder of our time, I'm just going to quickly talk about navigating the item bank and some best practices as it relates to Aware directly. So one of the main pieces that you'll discover is as you're adding item types, you get the option when you click on our plus sign within the interface to search the item bank. So a lot of times teachers will go in and specifically pick a standard that they want to look at, and that is a great practice. Sometimes when you're trying to just familiarize yourself with the item bank, you can also choose to look at all standards. So then you get used to some of the ways that you can look through and you can filter what you have available. So again, you can choose one standard or you can choose all of the standards depending on what route you're going. We do have very high functioning filters that we want to make sure that you're utilizing to make your experience a lot more simplistic and finding exactly what you're looking for. So if you'll see, we do have a question type filter. So pertaining to exactly what Karen's talking about, you can find that interaction based on your design that you're looking for to see if there is a question in the item bank that really fits your needs, so that you're not just looking by standard, but you're also looking by that specific interaction to narrow it down. You're not limited there. And just like she said, for TEKSbank items, you can look through and see if we have just introduced this concept, we want to look for a DOK1 question and maybe not go straight to 3 and have that as an available option, because that wouldn't align and give us valuable data that we can move off of. So making sure that you select those options below so that your search is automatically filtered to exactly what you are looking for. Again, these are some fairly new alert options that we have within the item bank. So I really like to point these out. That our first one is a little tiny piece of paper, and it lets you know if any resource is attached to the question, so that you're not wondering what goes with this question based on the wording. It will be a good indicator to let you know that there's an attached resource that once this question is added, it will come alongside the question to support it. And again, we also added a little exclamation point for new interactive items and really any item that comes in from an item bank so that you can report it. I really like to lean into this because we're in a new world of assessing. And so these item types look very different. They are not an ABCD format and any type of traditional format that we're used to as even coders. And so they come in and they are called a custom interaction. So the way that one company could develop an interaction is completely different than the way another company could develop that interactive response item specifically. So we include this report item because everything cannot always work with complete fidelity with a custom item type. So we want you to double check these items and make sure that they are functioning properly and report to us when they are not. Okay, as we talk about adding questions to an assessment, we love the fact that you can add questions to what we call our little shopping cart there, and you can view the questions, you can reorder them. When you hover over, they expand out, so you get all of the quality information there. And of course, you can change your mind if you have replicated skill sets that you don't want to ask in the same format. You get that viewing capability before you add them to your test. So making sure that those look and are ordered the way that you would like them to. As a side note, it's always good to know that wherever you clicked the plus sign to search the item bank, that is where the questions will be added to your assessment. So if you went to the very bottom and that's where you wanted them, perfect. If you went to the top, that's where they'll be added. So it's based on the location in the assessment where you clicked on that plus sign to search the item bank. All right, editing within the test. These are just some good common reminders. Again, that preview option is your best friend. We added that little eyeball icon so that you could preview exactly what a student sees. To make sure that the interaction with these items is correct, that the verbiage is correct, and that everything matches and is fluid. We really wanted you to have another option to double check these. Again, it is a new world that we are all living in with these new item types. So double checking them is a great practice to have. You can also make sure here that you update DOK if it is missing, or if you have changed the question slightly and increased the depth of knowledge level. Of course, you would want to indicate that on the question here. Making sure that also within this interface is where you can add content clarifiers. So if you see areas where that could be a language barrier or an academic barrier, making sure that those content clarifiers are added as you're previewing the question is a great next step for making sure that they're ready to go. All right. Yeah, we have a question.
It's kind of a celebration / clarification when you were on the alerts and that resource icon. When that is noted on an item, it will automatically bring that resource in with the item as it's added to the test.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
All right, so some best, and that was very recent too. So good point. That was just a few weeks ago that we added that. So some best practices for item bank use. We'll look into some of those. One of my favorite ones that when I started training around the state last year, I said, go look at the test summary. That is going to be your best indicator of a roadmap or a blueprint of your assessment, because you automatically get that depth and complexity. In an overview, you get the total amount of questions, the standards that you ask and how many, and then you also get the item types below that you have utilized. So again, if you're really trying to meet that quota of 25%, you can easily gauge that, but also knowing that you don't have to add as many for local assessments if it's not needed. And you get that quick viewpoint of where your test is and what it looks like holistically. Okay, how can the test key help as well? And so here we really like to point out that when you go back through and preview your test key, again, it's another fail safe to make sure the standards there, the depth of knowledge is there, and then really importantly, based on how you chose your scoring method, is the scoring aligned for what you want? Because 9 times out of 10, when I talk to users, they'll say, we accidentally put our constructed responses more than half of the assessment and didn't realize it. So this is a great place to catch that before it happens and make sure that you have a clear projection of what you're hoping to gauge and align the assessment toward. All right, I think I've said it several times, but I emphasized it here 3 more. So make sure you preview those items, whether you use the eyeball or whether you go into the student interface in the preview option in online testing, make sure that you double check these and that they're filling your need and they're meeting the expectation of what the question is. Again, that's why that report feature is there. And so we're hoping to hear back from you because we pull them out. If there's anything wrong with them, then we pull them as quickly as we are informed. But if we don't know, then we keep all of these different question types available. So make sure that they're fitting your need and that you're double checking to make sure that the interaction that students will have is correct. Okay, and then some of the last pieces here, again, making sure those student supports are available. You can set these at the test level, or you can set them by individual students before proctoring the exam. So based on your assessment, we really want to make sure that students have the tools they need to showcase their learning, and missing opportunities for text-to-speech to be enabled or content clarifiers, that could really hinder a student's capability of answering that question appropriately, especially based on the complexity of that question alone. So making sure that they have these tools available, this is one of the #1 reasons the state went to online testing. So just doing that check to make sure that those tools are enabled for the students. And those are our last little pieces of how to use and some best practices for the item bank. So I'll see if we have any final questions here.
We have a couple coming in related to supports being auto-generated with item bank items. So the first one being text-to-speech with item bank questions, for example, pulling in alt text for images or a graph.
So all of those things are being considered. How we're reviewing those is as soon as the STAR assessment is given, we're going to go back through and really see how can we better support you with what we have available to you and how you're using the item banks and how they tie to an assessment as well. So all of those things are in consideration, and we review those in our roadmap every year. So those are definitely things we have on our to-do list.
Can you speak a little bit to content clarifiers importing in with item bank items and some of your thoughts there?
Absolutely. So again, that would be part of the item bank piece, and that we would review that as well as we're enhancing the overall item bank experience. We actually want to start there and make sure that the item bank experience is completely seamless for users. And that is definitely a key component, making sure that those content clarifiers are there. It's appropriate for the district to set those. So we wouldn't take those from an import because that's really not an acceptable practice. We would take those and allow the district to be able to establish those, because the district needs to decide what those look like for their area and for their student needs.
Thanks. Appreciate that clarification for what that might look like for item banks that are purchased and imported into the system versus what it would look like for that local item bank where the district can make some decisions about the content.